There is a stillness that exists in the heart of ancient places, a kind of quiet that belongs only to stones that have stood for thousands of years. And tonight we find ourselves wandering through the echoes of an empire that once stretched across the known world, an empire that rose from the dust of the Iranian plateau and reached toward horizons that seemed endless. The ancient Persian Empire, a name that carries with it the weight of centuries, the whisper of silk roads and caravans, the memory of kings who called themselves kings of kings. And in this moment, as darkness settles softly around us, we can imagine ourselves standing at the edge of that world, feeling the dry wind that crosses the high deserts, listening to the distant sound of water moving through underground channels called qanats, those ingenious waterways that brought life to places where life seemed impossible. Picture, if you will, the plateau itself, vast and severe, rimmed by mountains that rise like ancient guardians, the Zagros Range to the west, the Elbers to the north, and between them a land of extremes, where summer heat bakes the earth until it cracks, and winter cold descends with a sharpness that cuts through everything. Yet it was precisely this harshness that forged something remarkable, something that would reshape the world. The light here has a particular quality, especially in the hours when day begins to fade, when the sun hangs low and turns everything golden. The mud brick walls of distant settlements, the rocky outcrops that jut from the earth like broken teeth, the sparse vegetation that clings to life in the valleys, all of it bathed in amber and honey. And as shadows lengthen, there is a sense of time becoming fluid, of past and present blending together. We might begin our journey in the highlands, among the Persians themselves, a people who were not always emperors, who once lived simply among their flocks, who knew the rhythms of seasons and the movements of stars, who worshipped gods of light and darkness, of truth and deception, and who carried within their culture something that would prove more powerful than any army, a way of seeing the world that valued order, justice, the careful balance between freedom and structure. In these early evening hours, when the air begins to cool and the first stars appear, we can almost hear the distant past, the sound of hoofbeats on rocky ground, the low voices of men gathered around fires, discussing matters of cattle and pasture, of marriages and alliances, not yet knowing that their descendants would rule from the Mediterranean to the Indus, that their language would be spoken in palaces stretching across 3 continents, that their ideas about governance would echo through millennia. The landscape itself seems to hold these memories in the way that ancient landscapes do, the wadis and dry riverbeds remembering floods from centuries ago, the mountains holding within their stone the knowledge of empires risen and fallen. And if we are very quiet, very still, we can sense the presence of something vast, something that began small and grew until it touched the edges of the world. There is a particular kind of beauty in beginnings, in the moment before greatness emerges, when everything is still potential, still gathering, and the Persian story has this quality, this sense of slow accumulation, of pieces coming together across generations, of a people finding their voice, their vision, their destiny among the high plateaus and fertile valleys of what we now call Iran. Tonight we walk through this ancient realm not as conquerors or scholars, but as witnesses to something extraordinary, something built by human hands and human minds across the span of centuries. We observe the rise of cities in places where only tents had stood, the creation of roads where only animal tracks had wound through the hills, the establishment of laws where only custom had guided behavior, and all of it unfolding with the inevitability of a river finding its course to the sea. The empire that would emerge from these highlands, that would be known to history as the Achaemenid Empire, the first Persian Empire, would change everything it touched. And yet it would do so in ways that were often subtle, often gentle, preserving what it conquered, learning from those it defeated, building something new from the accumulated wisdom of Babylon and Egypt, of Lydia and Media, of a dozen cultures that would find themselves woven into a tapestry larger than any that had existed before. And so we begin in this quiet hour with the wind moving softly across ancient stones, with stars beginning to emerge in a darkening sky, with the sense of standing at the threshold of something immense, ready to follow the thread of this story wherever it leads, through palaces and gardens, across deserts and mountains, into the hearts of cities that hummed with life and purpose, discovering along the way what it meant to build an empire not only of territory, but of ideas. The story begins not with Persia, but with Media, a kingdom that rose in the northwestern reaches of the plateau, where the Zagros Mountains create valleys and passages, where tribes of horsemen had lived for generations, mastering the art of mounted warfare, breeding horses that were prized across the ancient world. And it was the Medes who first unified these Iranian peoples, who first created something larger than a collection of clans and villages. Around the 7th century before the Common Era, when Assyria still dominated the Near East with its fearsome military machine, the Median king Cyaxares began to forge alliances, to build an army, to transform scattered fighters into a disciplined force, and in the year 612, the Medes joined with Babylon, and together they brought down Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, ending an empire that had seemed invincible, scattering its stones across the earth. The fall of Nineveh echoes across the centuries, a moment when the old order crumbled, when new powers emerged from regions that had been overshadowed, and among those rising peoples were the Persians themselves, cousins to the Medes, dwelling further south in the region called Parsa, in the land of Fars, tending their flocks, maintaining their traditions, watching, waiting, learning. The Persians were vassals to the Medes at first, subordinate but never quite conquered in spirit, and their royal house, the Achaemenids, traced their lineage back through generations of chieftains, back to a legendary ancestor named Achaemenes, whose name would define a dynasty, whose descendants would inherit not just the plateau, but the world. In the mid-6th century, around 559 before the Common Era, a child was born into this royal Persian line, a boy who would carry the name Cyrus. And though we cannot know the details of his early years, cannot see into the chambers where he learned to read and ride, to fight and govern, we know that something extraordinary was being shaped, some combination of ambition and vision, of strategic brilliance and fundamental decency that would mark him as different from other conquerors. Cyrus grew to manhood in a world of careful balances, where Media held the dominant position, where his own grandfather, Astyages, ruled as king of the Medes, where alliances were sealed through marriage and broken through betrayal, where a young prince had to navigate currents of power that could destroy the unwary, and somewhere in those years, Cyrus learned not just to survive, but to see possibilities that others missed. The rebellion came around 553, when Cyrus raised the banner of Persian independence, when he challenged his Median overlords and gambled everything on a single throw. The details are wrapped in legend now, stories of prophetic dreams and divine favor, tales of Astyages' paranoia and self-destructive choices, but beneath the mythology lies a simple truth. Cyrus won, and in winning, he did something unexpected. He did not destroy the Median kingdom, did not slaughter its nobles or burn its cities. Instead, he absorbed it, welcomed the Medes as partners rather than subjects, kept their aristocracy in positions of honor, and created something new, a dual kingdom of Medes and Persians, united under his rule, setting a pattern that would define Persian imperial policy for generations to come. This was revolutionary in an age when conquest meant annihilation, when victors typically razed cities and enslaved populations, when gods of the defeated were smashed and temples burned. Cyrus offered something different, a kind of empire that preserved rather than destroyed, that sought to incorporate rather than eliminate, and this approach would prove more durable than bronze or iron. With Media and Persia united, Cyrus turned his attention westward, toward Lydia, that wealthy kingdom in Anatolia where King Croesus ruled from his capital at Sardis, where gold flowed from the rivers and merchants grew rich on trade. Croesus was powerful, confident, and he made the fateful decision to test the new Persian king, to strike first before this rising power could threaten his own realm. The war that followed unfolded across the Anatolian plateau, through bitter winter campaigns, and there is a story told of how Cyrus faced the Lydian cavalry, the finest mounted warriors of the age, by placing camels at the front of his army, knowing that horses unused to the scent of camels would panic and flee. Whether true or embellished, it captures something essential about Cyrus, his willingness to innovate, to think beyond conventional tactics, to find advantage in unexpected places. Sardis fell in 547, and with it came the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, those jewels of Hellenic culture, Miletus and Ephesus, Smyrna and Phocaea, suddenly finding themselves subjects of a Persian king. And once again, Cyrus showed restraint, allowed the Greeks to keep their laws and customs, asked only for tribute and loyalty, planted the seeds of a relationship that would be both fruitful and tragic in the centuries ahead. But the greatest prize still awaited, the most ancient of civilizations, the land between the rivers, Babylon, city of the Hanging Gardens and the Ishtar Gate, home to priests who had studied the stars for thousands of years, repository of knowledge stretching back to Sumer and Akkad, and in 539, Cyrus turned his armies toward Mesopotamia. The Babylonian king Nabonidus had alienated his own people, neglected the worship of Marduk, the city god, spent years away in Arabia, while his son Belshazzar ruled in his stead. And when the Persian army approached, when Cyrus diverted the Euphrates and entered the city through the riverbed, there was barely any resistance. The gates opened, the people welcomed him, and Babylon, greatest city of the ancient world, passed into Persian hands almost without bloodshed. What happened next defined the character of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the chosen of Marduk, the legitimate king of Babylon, restorer of order and piety. He reversed Nabonidus's religious policies, returned the statues of gods to their proper temples, allowed peoples who had been deported to return to their homelands. And among those who benefited from this policy were the Jews, exiled in Babylon for 2 generations, who were now permitted to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple, to restore their worship. This act is recorded in the Hebrew Bible in the books of Ezra and Chronicles, where Cyrus is called the Lord's anointed, the only Gentile ever given such an honor in Scripture, and whether motivated by policy or principle, by political calculation or genuine tolerance, it created a legacy, established Cyrus as something more than a conqueror, as a liberator, as a different kind of king. The Cyrus cylinder, that clay artifact inscribed with Babylonian cuneiform, tells the story in the king's own voice, proclaims his peaceful entry into Babylon, his restoration of religious practices, his concern for justice and good governance, and while it is a piece of propaganda, as all royal inscriptions are, it also reveals a governing philosophy, a belief that empire could be best built on something other than terror, that diverse peoples could be held together through respect rather than force alone. From the Mediterranean to Central Asia, from the Caucasus to the Persian Gulf, Cyrus had created the largest empire the world had yet seen, and he ruled it with a light touch, allowing subject peoples to keep their languages, their religions, their local customs, asking in return only tribute and military service, binding his realm together through roads and messengers, through a postal system that could carry messages across thousands of miles, through garrisons strategically placed but not oppressively numerous. The empire was organized into satrapies, provinces governed by officials called satraps, who wielded considerable autonomy in their regions, who collected taxes and maintained order, who commanded local forces, but who were watched by the king's eyes and ears, inspectors who traveled the roads, who reported directly to the central authority, who ensured that the satraps remained loyal, that they did not become too independent, too powerful, too ambitious. This administrative structure was brilliant in its flexibility, allowing for local variation while maintaining overall unity, permitting the Egyptians to live as Egyptians, the Babylonians as Babylonians, the Greeks as Greeks, all under the umbrella of Persian sovereignty, and at the center of it all, in the heartland of Persia, in cities like Pasargadae, the king presided over a court of diverse peoples where Medes and Persians shared honors, where subject peoples sent tribute and gifts, where the wealth of continents flowed together. Cyrus died around 530, campaigning on the northeastern frontier, fighting nomadic tribes beyond the Oxus River, and his body was brought back to Pasargadae, placed in a simple tomb, a stepped monument of stone that still stands today, modest by the standards of royal tombs, reflecting perhaps the character of the man, and inscribed with words that may or may not be authentic, but which capture his legacy. O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come, I am Cyrus who won the empire for the Persians. Do not therefore begrudge me this bit of earth that covers my bones. His son Cambyses inherited an empire and sought to expand it, turned his eyes toward Egypt, that ancient land of the Nile, and in 525 the Persian army crossed the Sinai, defeated the pharaoh at Pelusium, and added the oldest civilization on earth to the Persian realm, Egypt, with its pyramids and temples, its priests and its intricate theology, its vast agricultural wealth, all became part of the Achaemenid dominion. But Cambyses would not enjoy his conquest long. Within 3 years he was dead, and the empire plunged briefly into crisis, into succession struggles and the emergence of a pretender, or perhaps a legitimate heir. The historical record is murky, confused, contradictory, but from this chaos emerged a man named Darius of the Achaemenid line, but not the direct succession, who claimed the throne and fought to secure it, and who would become the great organizer, the true architect of the Persian imperial system. Darius claimed descent from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid family, traced his lineage back to a common ancestor with Cyrus, and whether his claim was entirely legitimate or partly constructed, he seized power with determination, crushed rebellions that erupted across the empire in Babylon and Media, in Parthia and Margiana, in Egypt and Elam, and he recorded these victories on the face of a cliff at Behistun, where the rock rises sheer above an ancient highway, where travelers for centuries would crane their necks to see the inscription carved high above, written in 3 languages, Persian and Elamite and Babylonian, declaring his right to rule, his divine mandate, his triumph over chaos. The Behistun inscription is extraordinary, not just as propaganda, but as a historical document, carved at a height that made it almost impossible to reach, meant to be seen but not easily read, a message as much to the gods as to humanity. And it tells the story of Darius's first year, of how he fought 19 battles, defeated 9 rebel kings, restored order to an empire that had nearly torn itself apart, all accomplished with a ruthlessness that contrasted sharply with Cyrus's legendary mercy, yet also with an administrative genius that would reshape the entire structure of Persian governance. Darius understood that an empire of this size could not be held together through personality alone, through the charisma of a single ruler. It needed systems, institutions, predictable structures that would function whether the king was present or absent, whether he was strong or weak, and so he set about creating them, transforming what Cyrus had built through conquest into something that could endure through generations. He reorganized the satrapies, redrew their boundaries, standardized their administration, established fixed tribute amounts for each province, and these tributes were carefully calculated based on the productive capacity of each region. Egypt sent grain and gold, Babylon sent silver, India sent gold dust and exotic woods, Arabia sent frankincense, and all of it flowed toward the Persian heartland, enriching the royal treasuries, funding armies and building projects, sustaining a court of unimaginable splendor. But Darius demanded more than tribute. He demanded efficiency, accuracy, accountability, and to achieve this he introduced a standardized coinage, the daric, a gold coin bearing the image of the king as archer, which became the common currency of empire, facilitating trade across vast distances, allowing merchants in Sardis to do business with merchants in Babylon, creating economic integration to match political unity. The roads were expanded, improved, maintained with imperial resources. The royal road ran from Sardis to Susa, a distance of some 1,500 miles, with posting stations every 14 miles or so, where royal messengers could change horses, where they could carry correspondence from one end of the empire to the other in a week, a speed that would not be matched again until the 19th century. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, marveled at these careers, writing that neither snow nor rain, nor heat nor darkness stayed them from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, words that would echo across millennia. Darius built new capitals, created architectural wonders that expressed the grandeur of his vision at Susa, the ancient Elamite city. He constructed a palace complex of extraordinary sophistication, bringing cedar from Lebanon, gold from Sardis and Bactria, lapis lazuli from Sogdiana, ivory from Ethiopia and India, employing craftsmen from across the empire, Babylonians who made the bricks, Medes and Egyptians who worked the gold, Ionians who carved the stone, creating something that was truly imperial, that blended the artistic traditions of a dozen cultures into a unified aesthetic. But his greatest achievement, the monument that still speaks across the centuries, was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built on a massive stone terrace at the foot of the Mountain of Mercy, Ku-e-Rahmat, in the heartland of Persia itself. Here Darius created a city meant to awe, to inspire, to demonstrate the power and sophistication of Persian kingship, and construction began around 515, continued through his reign and that of his successors, growing more elaborate with each generation. The terrace itself was cut from living rock, raised 40 feet above the plain, approached by a double stairway so gentle that horses could climb it, and at the top, through the gate of all nations, visitors entered a world unlike anything else on earth. Massive columns soared overhead, some reaching heights of 60 feet or more, topped with capitals carved in the shape of bulls or griffins, their twin heads supporting the roof beams, and everywhere there was relief sculpture, processions of subject peoples bringing tribute, soldiers standing guard, the king receiving supplicants, images of the Nowruz festival, the Persian New Year, when representatives from every corner of the empire gathered to renew their loyalty. These reliefs are remarkable for what they show and for what they omit. There are no scenes of battle, no images of conquest or violence. Instead, there is order, dignity, mutual respect. The subject peoples are shown in their traditional dress, maintaining their ethnic identity, bringing gifts rather than being dragged as captives. And while this certainly served propaganda purposes, it also reflected a genuine Persian ideal, the notion that empire should bring peace, prosperity, the ability of diverse peoples to coexist under a just ruler. The Apadana, the great audience hall, could hold 10,000 people, its roof supported by 72 columns. And here, during the Nowruz celebrations, the king would sit on his throne, would receive the delegations from the satrapies, would accept their tribute, would distribute gifts in return, would preside over ceremonies that lasted for days, that included feasting and music, poetry and religious rituals, all designed to reinforce the bonds that held this vast realm together. Religion played a crucial role in Persian imperial ideology, though not in the way it did in other ancient empires. The Persians worshipped Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, God of light and truth, and they followed the teachings of Zoroaster, the prophet who had preached a dualistic theology, a cosmic struggle between good and evil, between truth and falsehood, between order and chaos. This worldview shaped Persian kingship. The king was understood as the champion of Ahura Mazda, the defender of truth, the bringer of order, and his inscriptions constantly invoke the god's favor and protection. Yet the Persians did not impose their religion on subject peoples, did not demand conversion, did not suppress other forms of worship. In Egypt, Persian kings styled themselves as pharaohs, participated in traditional Egyptian rituals, supported the temples and priesthoods. In Babylon, they honored Marduk and the Babylonian pantheon, presented themselves as legitimate Mesopotamian rulers. This religious tolerance was not merely pragmatic, though it certainly was pragmatic. It also flowed from Zoroastrian theology, which recognized that truth could manifest in different forms, that the struggle against the lie was more important than uniformity of worship. Darius ruled for 36 years, and during that time he extended Persian power further than any predecessor, eastward into the Indus Valley, westward into Thrace and Macedonia, northward toward the steppes, and in 513 he crossed the Bosporus with a massive army, campaigned against the Scythians in the lands north of the Black Sea, pursuing those nomadic horsemen across vast grasslands, burning their pastures, trying to force them into battle. But the Scythians simply retreated, drew the Persians deeper into hostile territory, harassed their supply lines, and eventually Darius was forced to withdraw, having achieved little except to demonstrate the limits of Persian power, that there were peoples and places beyond the empire's reach. The Greek cities of Ionia, those colonies on the Aegean coast that had fallen to Cyrus, grew restless under Persian rule, chafed at the tribute requirements, at the Persian-appointed tyrants who governed them, and in 499 they revolted, appealed to their mother cities in Greece for help. Athens sent ships, Eretria sent troops, and together the Ionians marched on Sardis, burned the lower city, threatened Persian authority in the entire region. Darius crushed the Ionian revolt within 5 years, destroyed Miletus, the leading rebel city, scattered its population, reimposed Persian control with an iron hand. But he did not forget the involvement of Athens, did not forgive the burning of Sardis, and he determined to punish the Greeks, to extend Persian power into Europe proper, to bring these fractious city-states into the imperial system. The first expedition came in 492, when a Persian force crossed into Thrace, subdued the coastal regions, but was wrecked by a storm off Mount Athos. The fleet shattered, thousands drowned, and the attempt was abandoned. But Darius was not deterred. 2 years later, in 490, he sent another force, this time directly across the Aegean, targeting Athens and Eretria specifically. Eretria fell first, was besieged and betrayed and destroyed, its people enslaved, and then the Persian forces, perhaps 25,000 strong, landed on the plain of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens, expecting to march on the city, to install a friendly tyrant, to add Greece to the list of subject territories. But the Athenians marched out to meet them. 9,000 hoplites in bronze armor, supported by 1,000 Plataeans, and they attacked the Persian line, broke through on the wings, surrounded the center, and won a shocking victory, killed perhaps 6,000 Persians while losing fewer than 200 of their own, and sent the invaders reeling back to their ships. Marathon entered Greek legend immediately, became the defining moment of Athenian identity, proof that free men fighting for their homes could defeat the vast armies of despotism, and the runner who carried news of victory back to Athens, who supposedly ran the entire distance and died after delivering his message, gave his name to a race that endures to this day. But from the Persian perspective, Marathon was a minor setback, an expedition that failed, nothing that threatened the empire's stability or security. Darius planned another campaign, a much larger one, but he died before it could be launched in 486, and the throne passed to his son Xerxes, who inherited not just an empire but his father's determination to punish Greece, to complete what had been started at Marathon, to demonstrate that Persian power could not be defied with impunity. Xerxes spent 4 years preparing, gathering forces from across the empire, building a supply fleet, constructing bridges across the Hellespont, cutting a canal through the peninsula of Athos to avoid the storms that had destroyed the earlier fleet. And in 480, he led what may have been the largest army yet assembled in human history across into Europe. Sources speak of millions, which is surely exaggerated, but it was certainly massive, perhaps 200,000 fighting men, supported by hundreds of ships, a force that seemed unstoppable. The Greeks were divided. Many cities chose to submit, to offer earth and water, the traditional symbols of surrender. But Sparta and Athens refused, formed an alliance determined to resist, and at Thermopylae, the narrow pass between mountains and sea, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas made their stand, held the pass for 3 days against the entire Persian army until they were betrayed, outflanked, surrounded, and died to the last man, buying time for the Greek cities to prepare their defenses. Xerxes swept south, occupied Athens, burned the Acropolis in revenge for Sardis, seemed on the verge of total victory, but the Athenians had evacuated their city, had put their faith in their fleet, and at Salamis, in the narrow waters between the island and the mainland, the Greek triremes trapped and destroyed the Persian fleet, turned the waters red with blood, sent Xerxes' naval power to the bottom of the Aegean, and suddenly the great invasion was in jeopardy. Supply lines threatened, retreat necessary. Xerxes returned to Asia, left behind an army under Mardonius to continue the campaign, but the next year at Plataea, the combined Greek forces won another decisive victory, destroyed the remaining Persian army in Greece, and the threat was ended. The expansion into Europe halted, the limits of Persian power definitively established. The defeats in Greece marked a turning point, not in the empire's survival, for Persia remained vast and powerful, controlling territories far larger than those it had failed to conquer, but in its character, its direction, its relationship with the edges of its world. The empire turned inward after Salamis and Plataea, focused on consolidating what it held rather than expanding further, and this shift, subtle at first, would define the next century and a half of Achaemenid rule. Xerxes returned to his capitals, to Persepolis and Susa, and there he devoted himself to building, to completing the works his father had begun, adding new palaces and audience halls, creating the Hall of 100 columns, even larger than the Apadana, a forest of stone pillars supporting a roof that seemed to touch the sky, and he lived surrounded by luxury, by courtiers and concubines, by the elaborate protocol of Persian kingship, where the king was increasingly remote, increasingly hidden behind screens and ceremonies, visible only on great occasions, speaking only through intermediaries. The Greek historians Herodotus and later Ctesias, who knew Persia only from the outside or from brief visits, painted pictures of Oriental despotism, of cruelty and excess, of harems and eunuchs, of poisonings and palace intrigues. And while these accounts are biased, colored by Greek assumptions about barbarian kingdoms, they also contain kernels of truth. The Persian court was vast and complex, governed by intricate hierarchies, where access to the king meant power, where court factions competed for influence, where succession was never entirely secure. Xerxes was murdered in 465, killed in his bedroom by the commander of his guard, and his son Artaxerxes came to the throne amid violence and uncertainty, immediately facing a rebellion by his own brother, and then a massive uprising in Egypt, where nationalist sentiment had never been fully suppressed, where Persian rule sat lightly on a civilization that had existed for millennia before Cyrus, and it took years to restore order, to reassert control over the Nile Valley, years during which the empire seemed vulnerable, fractured. Yet the administrative systems that Darius had created proved their worth. The satrapies continued to function, tribute continued to flow, the roads carried messages and armies, and gradually Artaxerxes stabilized his rule, even achieved a significant diplomatic victory, when in 449 he concluded the Peace of Callias with Athens, ending decades of intermittent warfare, establishing spheres of influence. The Persians would stay out of the Aegean, the Athenians would stay out of Asia Minor, and both powers could focus on other concerns. For Athens, this meant building an empire of its own in the Aegean, transforming the Delian League into an instrument of Athenian domination. But for Persia, it meant something different. It meant adapting to a new reality, one in which Greek city-states, tiny by Persian standards, could not be easily conquered, could not be simply absorbed into the imperial system, and this required a shift in strategy, from direct control to indirect influence, from military conquest to diplomatic manipulation. The Persians became masters of Greek politics, not through armies, but through gold, subsidizing whichever side would serve Persian interests, playing Athens against Sparta, supporting oligarchs against democrats, ensuring that Greece remained divided, too busy fighting itself to threaten Persian territories. And this policy worked brilliantly when the Peloponnesian War erupted in 431, tearing Greece apart for a generation. Persian satraps in Asia Minor carefully distributed funds, prolonging the conflict, weakening all the combatants, maintaining Persian security through Greek discord. The 4th century before the Common Era saw the empire at its most stable and perhaps its most decadent. Artaxerxes II ruled for 46 years, from 405 to 359, presiding over a realm that was wealthy, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, but also increasingly fragmented, increasingly dependent on mercenary armies rather than loyal Persian troops, increasingly vulnerable to rebellion in the satrapies, where governors built up personal power bases, maintained their own forces, sometimes withheld tribute, and the central authority struggled to enforce its will across such vast distance. Egypt broke away multiple times, establishing independent dynasties. Resisting Persian attempts at reconquest for decades, and the satraps of Asia Minor, far from the centers of power, became virtually autonomous, ruling their territories like kings, acknowledging Persian sovereignty in name while acting independently in practice. The empire was becoming less a unified state than a confederation of semi-independent regions, held together by tradition, by mutual benefit, by the absence of any alternative system. Yet culturally, Persia remained dominant. Persian remained the language of administration from Anatolia to India. Persian artistic styles influenced subject peoples. Persian gardens, those enclosed paradises with their careful geometries, their fountains and pools, their cypress trees and roses, were copied throughout the ancient world. The Persian model of kingship, of the great ruler who dispensed justice and favor, who maintained roads and postal systems, who protected trade and punished bandits, this became the template for subsequent empires, from Alexander's successors to Rome to the Islamic caliphates. The Achaemenid Persian Empire also became a great synthesizer, a place where ideas and technologies from different cultures met and mingled, where Babylonian astronomy influenced Greek philosophy, where Indian mathematics traveled west, where Egyptian medicine combined with Persian pharmacology. The empire was a vast laboratory of cultural exchange, and though it was held together by Persian military and administrative power, it was also enriched by the diversity of its subjects, by the talents and knowledge of Phoenician sailors and Jewish scribes, Greek doctors and Babylonian engineers. Religious developments continued to evolve. Zoroastrianism became more formalized, with a priestly class, the Magi, who maintained the sacred fires, who performed rituals, who preserved the oral traditions that would eventually be written down in the Avesta, the holy text. But alongside this, other forms of worship flourished: the cult of Mithra, the worship of Anahita, the goddess of waters, and the Persians continued to respect the religions of subject peoples, to participate in local cults when politically useful, to maintain a kind of theological pluralism that was unusual for the ancient world. Trade flourished across the empire. The royal road and its extensions carried not just official correspondence, but merchants and their goods. Silk from China began to trickle westward. Spices from India and Arabia commanded high prices in Mediterranean markets. Phoenician traders, subjects of the Persian king, dominated commerce throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and the empire's relative peace, the absence of major internal conflicts for long stretches, allowed commerce to thrive, cities to grow, wealth to accumulate. But beneath this prosperity, structural weaknesses grew more pronounced. The empire was expensive to maintain, required constant tribute to fund the court, the armies, the building projects, and when satrapies rebelled or withheld taxes, the burden fell more heavily on those regions that remained loyal, creating resentment, encouraging further rebellion, a cycle that was difficult to break, and the Persian kings increasingly relied on mercenaries, especially Greek hoplites, who fought for pay rather than loyalty, who could be hired by the highest bidder, who had no stake in the empire's survival. The great satraps' revolt of the mid-4th century, around 370 to 360, saw multiple provinces rise against the central authority, and though it was eventually suppressed, it revealed the fragility of imperial control. The degree to which the empire had become a loose aggregation of territories rather than a tightly governed state, and successive kings struggled to reassert authority, to reform the administration, to find new sources of revenue, but the fundamental problems remained. Distances too vast, local powers too entrenched, central authority too weak to enforce its will consistently. Artaxerxes III, who ruled from 358 to 338, was the last strong Achaemenid king. He crushed rebellions ruthlessly, reconquered Egypt with brutal efficiency, reimposed Persian authority across the empire, but his methods created as many problems as they solved. The violence, the confiscations, the executions bred fear and resentment, weakened loyalty, created opportunities for ambitious men to plot and scheme. He was poisoned by his own vizier, and the succession passed through a series of weak rulers, puppets of court factions, until Darius III came to the throne in 336, a man of some courage and dignity, but unlucky in his timing, for across the Aegean, in Macedonia, a young king named Alexander had just completed the conquest of Greece and was turning his eyes eastward, dreaming of Persian glory, of matching or exceeding the deeds of Cyrus and Xerxes, of proving that Greek discipline and courage could overcome the vast numbers of the Orient. The confrontation came quickly. Alexander crossed into Asia in 334, won his first victory at the Granicus River, began liberating or conquering the Greek cities of Ionia, and the next year at Issus he met Darius III in battle, routed the Persian army, sent the great king fleeing, captured his family, his mother and wife and daughters, and demonstrated that Persian military power, so long unchallenged in the East, could not stand against Macedonian phalanxes and Alexander's tactical genius. Darius tried to negotiate, offered alliance, marriage connections, half his empire, but Alexander wanted everything, wanted to be king of kings himself, and he pressed eastward, took Phoenicia and Egypt, welcomed as a liberator by populations that had chafed under Persian rule, and then turned inland toward the heartland, toward Mesopotamia, toward the final confrontation that would decide the empire's fate at Gaugamela, near the ancient ruins of Nineveh, in 331. The two armies met in what was supposed to be the decisive battle. Darius had assembled forces from across the empire, perhaps 100,000 men or more, cavalry from Bactria, scythed chariots, war elephants from India, the full panoply of Persian military might, and he chose a flat plain where his numbers would tell, where the chariots could charge, where Persian cavalry could envelop the smaller Macedonian force. But Alexander's army was a precision instrument, disciplined, experienced, led by the most gifted commander of the age, and the Macedonians carved through the Persian lines, targeted Darius himself, drove straight for the great king's position, and once again Darius fled, abandoning his army, abandoning his empire, fleeing eastward with a handful of followers, hoping perhaps to raise new forces in the distant satrapies, to continue the fight from Bactria or Sogdiana. But it was finished. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, was crowned in the ancient manner, then moved on to Susa, to Persepolis, and at Persepolis, whether in drunken celebration or calculated policy, he burned the great palace, sent flames roaring through the halls that Darius and Xerxes had built, destroyed the architectural wonder that had symbolized Persian power, reduced it to charred ruins, and with that fire, the Achaemenid Empire, 2 centuries old, the greatest power the world had yet known, effectively ended. Darius III fled further east, but his own satraps betrayed him, murdered him to curry favor with Alexander, and his body was found on a dusty road in Bactria, the last of the Achaemenid line, the final king of kings, dead in ignominy, and Alexander took up his crown, claimed his empire, presented himself as the legitimate successor, the new Cyrus, though the Persians themselves, conquered but not destroyed, would remember things differently, would preserve their own histories, their own sense of what had been lost. The empire that fell so quickly to Alexander had endured for more than 2 centuries, had governed territories encompassing perhaps 40 or 50 million people, had created systems of administration and communication that would influence empires for millennia to come, and yet it vanished almost overnight, conquered by an army of perhaps 50,000 Macedonians, led by a king barely into his 20s. And this swift collapse invites us to wonder, to consider what it means for something so vast to be so fragile, what it reveals about power and legitimacy, about the difference between controlling territory and winning hearts. The Achaemenid Persians never sought to erase the identities of their subjects, never tried to make Egyptians into Persians or Babylonians into Medes. They governed through accommodation, through respect for local customs and traditions, through a light administrative touch that allowed considerable autonomy. And this approach worked brilliantly for generations, created an empire of unprecedented diversity and extent. But it also meant that when the center failed, when the great king could no longer protect his subjects, could no longer maintain order, those subjects had little emotional investment in the empire's survival. Alexander understood this, presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, as the rightful heir to Persian kingship. He wore Persian dress, adopted Persian court ceremonial, married Roxana, a Bactrian princess, encouraged his officers to take Persian wives, tried to blend Greek and Persian elements into a new synthesis, and in many ways he succeeded, creating a Hellenistic world that preserved elements of Achaemenid administration while infusing it with Greek culture and philosophy. The Persian legacy flowed into this new world, into the kingdoms of Alexander's successors, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, even into the Mauryan Empire in India, where Chandragupta built an administrative system influenced by Persian models and the idea of universal empire, of a single ruler governing diverse peoples in peace and prosperity. This became a template that Rome would later claim, that Islamic caliphates would invoke, that echoed through history long after Persepolis had fallen into ruin. The Zoroastrian faith survived the conquest, continued to be practiced in Persia and beyond, influenced emerging religions through its dualistic cosmology, its emphasis on ethical choice between good and evil, its vision of a final judgment and resurrection. Scholars have long debated the connections between Zoroastrian thought and later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, whether the Persian emphasis on angels and demons, on cosmic struggle and ultimate redemption, shaped the development of Western religious imagination. The ruins of Persepolis stood for centuries as a monument to vanished glory. Local people called them Takht-e Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, associating them with legendary Persian kings from before history, and travelers would come to marvel at the columns still standing, at the relief sculptures still visible, at the stairways where once the representatives of nations had climbed bearing tribute. And in these stones, weathered by wind and rain, scorched by Alexander's fire, there remained something of the vision that had built them, the dream of an ordered world, of diverse peoples united under just rule. Persian culture experienced a renaissance centuries later under the Sasanian Empire, which ruled from the 3rd to the 7th centuries of the Common Era, and which explicitly claimed descent from the Achaemenids, sought to revive ancient glories, to restore Persian kingship, and while the Sasanians were different in many ways, more centralized, more religiously orthodox, they preserved and transmitted elements of Achaemenid heritage, kept alive the memory of Cyrus and Darius, maintained the tradition of Persian imperial grandeur. When Islam swept across the Iranian plateau in the 7th century, it brought a new religion, a new language of administration, Arabic alongside Persian, but it did not erase Persian identity. Instead, Persian culture adapted, absorbed, transformed, and eventually reasserted itself. The great Persian poets, Ferdowsi, Hafez, Rumi, wrote in New Persian, celebrated ancient heroes, preserved pre-Islamic legends and histories, and their works ensured that the memory of ancient Persia, of the Achaemenid glory, would never entirely fade. The Cyrus cylinder, that clay record of Babylon's conquest, was rediscovered in the 19th century, excavated from the ruins of Babylon, and it became a symbol interpreted as the first declaration of human rights, as evidence of Persian tolerance and enlightenment. And while this interpretation may be overstated, may read too much modern sensibility into ancient propaganda, it also captures something true about the Persian approach to empire, the preference for incorporation over destruction, for pragmatic accommodation over ideological purity. In our own time, the Achaemenid Empire serves as a reminder that there are different models of power, different ways of organizing diverse peoples, that empires can be built on something other than simple domination, and while we should not romanticize, should not ignore the violence and exploitation that undergirded even the most enlightened ancient regime, we can still recognize something distinctive, something that set Persian kingship apart from many of its contemporaries, a vision, however imperfectly realized, of unity in diversity, of strength through tolerance. And so we come to the end of this long journey, through highlands and river valleys, through palace corridors and battlefields, through the rise and fall of an empire that changed the world. And in this quiet hour, as our thoughts drift across the centuries, we can almost see them, those ancient Persians, standing on the terrace at Persepolis during Nowruz, watching the sun rise over the mountains, celebrating the new year, renewing the bonds that held their world together. The wind still blows across the Iranian plateau, across the same mountains and deserts that Cyrus knew, and the ruins of Persepolis still stand, columns rising against the sky, relief sculptures still showing their processions of gift-bearers, still preserving in stone the memory of an empire that believed in order, in justice, in the possibility of governing the world with something approaching wisdom. The story of ancient Persia is ultimately a human story of ambition and vision, of organizational genius and military prowess, of tolerance coexisting with conquest, of an attempt to create something lasting in a world of constant change. And while the empire fell, while Alexander's fire consumed the palaces, while the satraps scattered and the tribute ceased to flow, something remained, something that could not be destroyed by any conqueror. It remained in the memory of peoples who had lived under Persian rule, in the administrative systems that successor states copied, in the ideas about kingship and governance that echoed through later centuries, in the cultural exchanges that had flourished along the royal road, in the religious concepts that spread from Zoroastrian theology into other faiths, in the very notion that diverse peoples could coexist, could be governed without losing their essential identities. The great Persian gardens, those paradises, gave their name to the concept of paradise itself, the word entering Greek, Latin, and eventually English, carrying with it the Persian vision of ordered beauty, of nature perfected through human design, of a space where water and shade and flowers created harmony. And this linguistic legacy, this gift of a word and concept, seems fitting. A civilization that valued beauty and order, that created spaces of tranquility amid the chaos of empire, leaving behind an idea of what paradise might be. Tonight, in the stillness, we can imagine standing in one of those ancient gardens, perhaps at Pasargadae, where Cyrus was buried, where water still flows through ancient channels, where the tomb still stands, simple and dignified, and the stars above are the same stars that two Persian astronomers studied, that guided caravans along the royal road, that looked down on armies and palaces, on the building of empires and their dissolution. The moon rises over distant mountains, casting silver light across the plateau, illuminating ruins that have stood for millennia. And in this light, time seems to fold, past and present merging, and we are left with the sense of something vast, something that cannot quite be grasped, the mystery of how human beings create order from chaos, build civilizations from dreams, leave marks on the earth that outlast their lives by thousands of years. The story fades now, like lamplight dimming, like voices growing distant, and we are left with images, fragments of a vanished world, the sound of hoofbeats on ancient roads, the sight of tribute bearers climbing marble stairs, the feeling of standing in a great hall supported by forests of columns, all of it drifting away, becoming memory, becoming history, becoming dream. And perhaps that is enough, to have walked for a time through that ancient world, to have felt something of its grandeur and complexity, to have touched, however briefly, the legacy of Persia, of Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, of the empire that stretched from sunrise to sunset, that believed in order and justice, that built wonders and dreamed of governing the world in peace. The wind blows across the plateau, across the ruins, across the centuries, carrying with it whispers of a time when Persian kings called themselves kings of kings, when tribute flowed from 40 nations, when the world seemed young and all things possible, and in the silence that follows, in the deep quiet of this ancient place, we can rest, knowing that we have traced the arc of something extraordinary, something that rose from dust, touched the stars, and returned to dust, leaving behind only stones and stories, and the eternal question of what it means to build, to dream, to reach for greatness in a world that is always, always fading into shadow. There is a certain kind of silence that exists in a room where something is thinking, not a living creature, but a machine, humming softly in the corner of a laboratory, a presence made of circuits and light. And in that silence, there is a story that stretches back through decades, through centuries of human dreaming. A story of how we learned to build Buddha minds from metal and glass, how we taught sand to remember, and how the world changed quietly, persistently, one calculation at a time. I find myself drawn tonight to this story, to the gentle unfolding of an idea that began long before the first computer ever switched on, back when computation meant something entirely different, when it meant a person sitting at a desk, working through columns of numbers with a pencil, their hand moving steadily across the page, carrying remainders, checking sums, the scratch of graphite on paper, the only sound in rooms where the future was being calculated by hand. The story doesn't begin with a sudden flash of invention, but rather with a slow accumulation, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer of human ingenuity, each generation adding something to what came before, building toward a threshold they couldn't quite see yet, though some of them sensed it, dreamed of it, wrote about it in letters and journals that survive to this day. Picture the world in the 1800s, when mathematicians like Charles Babbage sat in their studies, contemplating engines made of brass and iron, machines with thousands of moving parts, gears that would mesh and turn, carrying mechanical memory from one operation to the next, his analytical engine never fully built in his lifetime, but alive in detailed drawings, in the careful notations of Ada Lovelace, who saw in those theoretical gears something more than mere calculation, who glimpsed the possibility that such a machine might one day manipulate symbols, create patterns, perhaps even compose music, the quiet patience required to imagine such things, to design mechanisms that wouldn't be built for another century. There is something deeply peaceful about that kind of forward thinking, that faith in future minds who would pick up the thread and continue the work. And they did continue it through the mechanical calculators of the late 19th century, through the punched card systems that Hermann Hollerith developed, cards with patterns of rubrics of holes that could be sorted and counted by machine, used first to process the American census, transforming months of labor into weeks, the cards passing through readers, pins dropping through holes to complete circuits, a kind of binary thinking already emerging. Yes or no, hole or no hole, on or off. There's something almost meditative about imagining those cards, stacked in boxes, each one encoding a piece of information, each hole punched with precision, the mechanical sorters clicking and whirring as they organized data, finding patterns in populations, in demographics, in the countless small facts that make up a society, and then, gradually, as the 20th century began to unfold, the technology started to shift, started to incorporate electrical components, relays that could open and close faster than any mechanical gear, vacuum tubes that could switch currents on and off in fractions of a second. And with these new components, the possibilities began to expand, to accelerate, though still at what would seem to us now like a glacial pace. The story gathers momentum in the years before and during the Second World War, when urgent questions demanded urgent answers, when the need to break codes, to calculate trajectories, to process vast amounts of information quickly, pushed inventors and mathematicians and engineers to think differently, to work with new urgency. And yet even in that urgency there was careful thought, deliberate design, the kind of focused attention that creates lasting change. Tonight, as I trace this story out, I can almost hear the echo of those early machine rooms, the clatter of relays switching, the warm glow of vacuum tubes lighting up panels in dim laboratories, the smell of hot electronics and machine oil, and the people who tended these machines, who programmed them with patch cables and switches, who learned to think in the binary language that the machines understood, creating a new kind of conversation between human and mechanism, between question and answer. In the 1930s and early 40s, the idea of a universal computing machine was still more philosophy than reality, still living in the realm of thought experiments and theoretical papers. Alan Turing, working at Cambridge and later at Bletchley Park, had described in 1936 what he called a universal machine, an abstract concept, a device that could read symbols on an infinite tape, process them according to a set of rules, and write new symbols back. It was mathematics, pure and theoretical, but it contained within it the seed of every computer that would ever exist. The beauty of Turing's concept was its simplicity, its reduction of all computation to basic operations. Read a symbol, change state, write a symbol, move the tape, and yet from these simple steps not infinite complexity could emerge. Any calculation that could be described algorithmically could be performed given enough time, enough tape, enough patience, but patience was something the world of the 1940s couldn't afford much of. War had come to Europe, and with it, an urgent need for machines that could break encrypted messages, that could calculate artillery tables, that could process information faster than rooms full of human computers ever could. And so the theoretical began to become practical. The abstract began to take physical form. At Bletchley Park, in the British countryside, away from the bombs falling on London, a team of mathematicians and engineers built machines to break the German Enigma code, the bomb machines, electromechanical devices that could test thousands of possible rotor settings, clicking through combinations, searching for the one arrangement that would unlock that day's messages. Turing himself worked there, applying his theoretical knowledge to very practical problems. The machines running day and night, their operators listening to the rhythm of the rotors, learning to hear when the machine had found something promising. And then came Colossus, completed in 1943 at Bletchley Park, designed by Tommy Flowers and his team, the first programmable electronic digital computer, using vacuum tubes instead of mechanical relays, processing the encrypted German high command messages, the Lorenz cipher, far more complex than Enigma. Colossus used over 2,000 vacuum tubes, reading paper tape at high speed, 5,000 characters per second, a speed that seemed almost magical at the time. The room where Colossus operated was kept secret for decades after the war. The machine itself was largely destroyed, its existence classified, but it represented a threshold crossed, the proof that electronic components could be arranged to perform logical operations, that light could flow through circuits faster than thought, that electricity itself could be made to think in its own binary way. Across the Atlantic, parallel developments were unfolding at the University of Pennsylvania in a former fraternity house. Work began in 1943 on a machine called ENIAC. the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, commissioned by the United States Army to calculate artillery firing tables, the trajectories of shells, the countless variables of wind and weather and angle that determined where a projectile would land. ENIAC was enormous, occupying a room 40 feet by 80 feet, weighing 30 tons, containing 17,000 vacuum tubes, 7,000 crystal diodes, 10,000 capacitors, 70,000 resistors, 5 million hand-soldered joints. It consumed 150 kilowatts of power, enough to dim the lights in the neighborhood when it was switched on. The heat from all those vacuum tubes made the room unbearably warm, fans running constantly to prevent the components from burning out. Programming ENIAC was an elaborate physical process. Engineers, many of them women who had worked as human computers during the war, would set switches and plug in cables, physically routing the flow of electricity through different pathways to create different calculations. It could take days to set up a new problem, but once configured, ENIAC could perform calculations in seconds that would have taken human computers days or weeks to complete. The women who programmed ENIAC, Betty Snyder, John Bartik, Kay McNulty, Marlon Westkoff, Ruth Lichterman, Francis Belas, learned the machine's architecture intimately, understood how pulses of electricity moved through the circuits, how to diagnose problems when tubes failed, which happened frequently. They became the first true programmers. Though their contributions would be overlooked for decades, their work classified, their names absent from early histories. ENIAC was completed in 1945, just as the war was ending. Its first problems were peaceful, calculating tables for engineers, but also running calculations for the hydrogen bomb project, processing numbers that describe the physics of fusion, the enormous energies involved, the conditions that might allow humanity to recreate the power of stars. There's something profound in the fact that these early computers, built during wartime with military funding for military purposes, contained within them the seeds of transformation that would touch every aspect of human life, that the same machines designed to calculate destruction would eventually evolve into tools for creation, for communication, for preserving memory and knowledge. The late 1940s saw rapid evolution. John von Neumann, a mathematician of extraordinary range, working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, proposed a new architecture, a way of organizing computers that would become foundational, the von Neumann architecture, where both instructions and data were stored in the same memory, where programs could be modified by the computer itself, where software became as important as hardware. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but it changed everything. It meant that computers could be general-purpose machines, not hardwired for a single calculation, but flexible, capable of running different programs, of being transformed by the instructions fed into them. The hardware remained the same, but the behavior could be completely different depending on what was stored in memory. The EDVAC, Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, was designed with this architecture in mind, though it wasn't completed until 1952. By then, other machines had already implemented von Neumann's ideas. The Manchester Baby, built at the University of Manchester in England, ran its first program in June of 1948, a small machine by the standards of ENIAC, containing only 544 vacuum tubes, but it was the first stored program computer to actually run to execute instructions that were held in electronic memory rather than set by cables and switches. The program it ran was simple, designed to find the highest factor of a number. It ran for 52 minutes, cycling through calculations, and when it completed, it had proven something fundamental, that von Neumann's architecture worked, that computers could be programmed in software rather than hardware, that a new era had begun. At Cambridge, Morris Wilks and his team built EDSAC, the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, which began operating in May of 1949. It used mercury delay lines for memory, tubes filled with mercury where sound waves would travel, carrying pulses of information, the pulses bouncing back and forth, circulating through the tubes, each tube storing a few dozen numbers. The technology seems almost archaic now, using sound waves in liquid metal as a form of memory, but it worked. It was practical, and EDSAC ran for years, calculating problems in physics and engineering, becoming the first computer to provide a regular computing service to users. Wilks also developed one of the first assembly languages, a way of writing programs using symbolic instructions rather than pure binary, making it easier for humans to express algorithms, to think in terms that were closer to mathematics than to raw machine operations. And with that, programming began to become a craft, a discipline, something that required not just mathematical knowledge, but also a kind of creative problem solving, a way of breaking down complex tasks into sequences of simple operations that a machine could execute. In America, UNIVAC 1, the Universal Automatic Computer, was completed in 1951, the first computer produced commercially in the United States. Remington Rand manufactured it, selling the first unit to the Census Bureau, bringing the story full circle back to Hollerith's punched cards. But now the processing was electronic, vastly faster, capable of handling the complexity of a modern census with something approaching ease. UNIVAC became famous in 1952 when it predicted the outcome of the presidential election, Eisenhower versus Stevenson. The CBS network had arranged to use UNIVAC to forecast results based on early returns. The machine predicted a landslide for Eisenhower, but the human experts didn't believe it, thought the computer must be wrong. So CBS waited to announce the prediction, and then, as the votes came in, the prediction proved accurate. The machine had seen patterns that the human analysts had missed, and suddenly the public began to understand that computers might be more than just calculating machines, that they might process information in ways that exceeded human capability. The 1950s brought a peculiar atmosphere to the world of computing. These machines still occupied entire rooms, still required teams of specialists to operate, still consumed enormous amounts of power, and yet they were becoming less rare, moving from military laboratories into universities, into government agencies, into the research departments of large corporations. IBM, which had been manufacturing punched card equipment for decades, began to take computing seriously, investing in research, in development, in the production of the machines that could be leased to businesses. The IBM 701, announced in 1952, was designed for business applications, not scientific calculations. It could read and write magnetic tape, process records, sort data, generate reports, the kind of work that businesses needed: accounting, inventory, payroll, And with each installation, computing moved a little further from the exclusive domain of mathematicians and physicists, began to touch the ordinary operations of commerce and administration. There was still an almost mystical quality to these machines, the way they filled rooms with their presence, rows of cabinets lined with electronics, panels of blinking lights, the whir of magnetic tape drives spinning, starting and stopping, the chatter of line printers hammering characters onto paper, operators moving between the machines, loading tapes, checking printouts, monitoring the status lights for signs of trouble. Vacuum tubes still failed regularly. Each machine had spare tubes on hand, and technicians who knew how to diagnose problems, how to locate the failed component among thousands, replace it, bring the machine back to life. Programming these machines required a deep understanding of their architecture, how memory was organized, how arithmetic operations were performed, how input and output worked. Early programmers worked with machine code, pure sequences of binary numbers, each instruction specifying an operation and the memory addresses it would work with. It was painstaking, error-prone. A single wrong digit could crash the entire program, and debugging meant poring over printouts, tracing the flow of execution, trying to understand where logic had gone wrong. Grace Hopper, working at Remington Rand, began developing what she called a compiler, a program that could translate more human-readable instructions into machine code. She believed that programmers shouldn't need to work at the level of individual machine instructions, that there should be a layer of abstraction, a way to write programs that described what you wanted to accomplish rather than exactly how the machine should do it. Her work led to Flowmatic, one of the first high-level programming languages, designed to look almost like English, to be readable by people who weren't electronics experts. This was revolutionary. The idea that you could write something like compare price to budget and have a compiler translate that into the dozens or hundreds of machine instructions needed to actually perform the comparison. It meant that programming could become more accessible, that business analysts could potentially write programs, that the bottleneck of having too few programmers might be eased. In 1957, an IBM team led by John Backus released Fortran, Formula Translation. Designed for scientific and engineering calculations, it allowed mathematicians to write programs using notation that looked like algebra, equations that the computer would solve, loops that would iterate through calculations, subroutines that could be called repeatedly. Suddenly, programming became less about managing the machine and more about expressing algorithms, about solving problems. The late 50s also saw the invention of the transistor becoming practical for computing. Transistors had been invented at Bell Labs in 1947, tiny semiconductor devices that could amplify or switch electronic signals, much smaller than vacuum tubes, much more reliable, consuming far less power, generating far less heat, but it took years to develop manufacturing techniques to make them cheap enough, reliable enough to replace tubes in computers. The first transistorized computers appeared in the late 1950s, machines that were dramatically smaller than their vacuum tube predecessors, that could run for days without component failures, that used a fraction of the power. The TX-0 at MIT, built in 1956, demonstrated what was possible, and soon manufacturers were racing to build fully transistorized machines. The IBM 7090, the Control Data 1604, each generation smaller, faster, more reliable than the last. And then, quietly, another revolution was beginning at Texas Instruments and at Fairchild Semiconductor. Engineers were figuring out how to build not just individual transistors, but entire circuits on single pieces of silicon, the integrated circuit, multiple transistors and resistors and capacitors, all fabricated together on a chip smaller than a fingernail. Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments demonstrated the first working integrated circuit in September of 1958, and Robert Noyce at Fairchild developed a practical manufacturing process. Soon after, this changed the trajectory of everything, because integrated circuits meant that complexity no longer required physical size. You could pack more and more components into the same space, or make the same capability smaller and smaller. The room-sized computers of the 1950s could, in principle, eventually fit on a desk, or in a briefcase, or in a pocket. Through the 1960s, computing expanded in multiple directions at once. IBM released the System /360 in 1964, a family of computers that all used the same instruction set, the same software, but came in different sizes and speeds. A business could start with a smaller model and upgrade to a larger one without rewriting all their programs. This concept of compatibility, of a platform that could grow, was transformative for commercial computing. Meanwhile, time-sharing systems were being developed, ways to allow multiple users to interact with a single computer simultaneously, each user at their own terminal, a teletype machine or a CRT display, connected by cable or phone line to the central computer, which would rapidly switch between users, giving each one a slice of computing time, so fast that it felt like you had the machine to yourself. This made computing interactive for the first time. Instead of submitting a batch job and waiting hours for results, you could type a command and see the response immediately, have a conversation with the machine, explore ideas iteratively. At MIT, Project Mac, the multiple access computer, demonstrated time sharing at scale, dozens of users connected to a single mainframe, each one running programs, editing text, compiling code, the system managing all the competing demands for memory and processor time. And from this emerged a culture of interactive computing, of terminals in offices and laboratories, of researchers who could test ideas quickly, who could develop software incrementally, seeing results as they worked rather than days later. The mini-computer revolution began in the mid-60s. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation building smaller, less expensive machines, not as powerful as IBM mainframes, but affordable for departments, for laboratories, for applications where a full mainframe was overkill, the PDP series, starting with the PDP-1 in 1960, then the PDP-8, which became the first mass-produced mini-computer, over 50,000 units sold, each one about the size of a refrigerator, costing thousands of dollars instead of millions, bringing computing within reach of universities, research groups, even some wealthy individuals. Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs, working on a PDP-7 and later a PDP-11, developed Unix, an operating system that would influence computing for decades. Unix was elegant, built on simple principles. Everything is a file. Small tools that do one thing well and can be combined. A hierarchical file system. Text-based configuration. It was written partly in C. a programming language Ritchie developed, which made Unix portable, able to run on different hardware with relatively little modification, and Unix spread through universities where students learned its philosophy, carried it with them into industry. The 1970s brought the microprocessor, Intel's 4004, released in 1971, a complete central processing unit on a single chip, designed originally for a calculator, but containing the essential elements of a computer: arithmetic logic, control logic, registers for temporary storage. It was a 4-bit processor capable of processing 4 binary digits at a time. Not powerful by any measure, but it was a processor on a chip. And soon Intel released the 8008, then the 80808-bit processors that were powerful enough to build real computers around. And people began to do exactly that. Hobbyists, electronics enthusiasts, people who had never had access to computing before. The Altair 8800, released in 1975 as a kit, sold by mail order from MITS in Albuquerque. It had no keyboard, no display, just switches on the front panel to enter programs, lights to show the state of memory, but it had an Intel 8080 processor, and it cost less than $400. Suddenly, computing was accessible. You could own a computer in your home, learn it intimately, program it yourself. The Altair created a community. Clubs formed. The Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley, where enthusiasts gathered to share designs, to show off their projects, to trade software. Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote a version of BASIC for the Altair, one of the first programs available for it, and that BASIC interpreter became the foundation of their company. Microsoft. Software was becoming a product, not just something that came bundled with hardware, but something valuable in itself. Other computers followed. The Apple I, designed by Steve Wozniak, sold mostly to hobbyists. Then the Apple II in 1977, which was different. It came assembled in a plastic case with a keyboard. It could display color graphics on a television. It had expansion slots so users could add capabilities, disk drives, printer interfaces, modems, and it came with BASIC built into ROM. Turn it on, and you could start programming immediately. No need to load software from tape first. The Apple II became the first successful personal computer, selling millions of units over its production life, finding its way into homes, into schools, into small businesses. People used it for games, for education, for writing, for managing finances. For the first time, computing was something that individuals could own, could explore, could make part of their daily lives without needing institutional access or specialized training. Around the same time, Commodore released the PET. Tandy released the TRS-80, each offering their own vision of personal computing, and the software ecosystem began to grow. VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program, released for the Apple II in 1979, transformed how people thought about personal computers. Suddenly, a computer wasn't just a toy or a curiosity. It was a tool that could save hours of work, that could model business scenarios, that could pay for itself in productivity. VisiCalc alone drove thousands of Apple II sales, people buying the hardware specifically to run that one program. The early 1980s saw computing become increasingly commercial, increasingly mainstream. IBM, which had dominated business computing with mainframes, entered the personal computer market in 1981 with the IBM PC. They designed it quickly using off-the-shelf components, an Intel 8088 processor, an open architecture that other companies could build hardware for, and crucially, they licensed the operating system MS-DOS from Microsoft rather than developing their own. This decision would have profound consequences because it meant that the operating system wasn't tied exclusively to IBM's hardware. Within months, other companies began producing IBM PC clones, compatible machines that could run the same software. Compaq, leading the way with a portable PC, then dozens of other manufacturers, each competing on price and features, but all running MS-DOS, all capable of running the growing library of PC software. Word processors like WordStar and later WordPerfect, spreadsheets like Lotus 123, databases like DBase. The PC became a platform, an ecosystem, and Microsoft, controlling the operating system, found itself at the center of that ecosystem. Meanwhile, Apple was pursuing a different vision. In 1984, they released the Macintosh, a computer built around a graphical user interface, windows, icons, a mouse pointer. The idea had been pioneered at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, where researchers had built experimental systems with graphical interfaces in the 1970s. But Apple brought it to the mass market, made it affordable, made it elegant. The Macintosh showed that computers didn't have to be intimidating, didn't require memorizing commands. You could point and click, drag and drop, see what you were doing represented visually on screen. The Mac struggled commercially at first. It was more expensive than PCs, had less software, but it found a devoted following among creative professionals, designers, publishers, educators, and it established that graphical interfaces were the future. Even Microsoft recognized this, spent years developing Windows, a graphical shell for MS-DOS, trying to match what Apple had achieved. The early versions were crude, but by Windows 3.1 in 1992, and especially Windows 95, the PC world had embraced the graphical paradigm that the Mac had pioneered. Through the 1980s, computers became faster, memory became cheaper, hard drives replaced floppy disks for storage, modems allowed computers to communicate over phone lines, bulletin board systems emerged, individuals running computers with phone lines connected, creating spaces where people could leave messages, share files, play games together. These were precursors to the internet, small networks, local communities, but they demonstrated the hunger for connection, for communication through computers. The internet itself, which had existed since the 1960s as ARPANET, a research network connecting universities and government facilities, began to open up, expand, new networks joined, protocols were standardized, TCP/IP became the common language by the late 1980s. The internet was no longer just for researchers, though it was still primarily text-based, email, newsgroups, FTP for file transfer, Telnet for remote login. You needed to know commands, understand protocols. But for those who learned, it offered a window into a global conversation, into resources scattered across continents. And then, in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, the European Physics Laboratory, released the World Wide Web, a system for linking documents across the internet using hypertext. You could click on a link and jump to another document anywhere in the world. The first web browsers were simple, text-based, but they demonstrated the concept. And when Mosaic, a graphical web browser, was released in 1993, suddenly the web became accessible, visual. You could see images in line with text, navigate by clicking, browse without understanding the underlying technology. The web grew exponentially from a few hundred websites in 1993 to millions by the late 90s. Everyone wanted a presence online. Businesses, universities, individuals creating personal pages. Early search engines like Yahoo and later Google helped people navigate this expanding universe of information, and computing, which had been about calculation, about processing data, about running applications, became increasingly about connection, about communication, about accessing information stored on distant servers. The late 90s saw the rise of laptops as practical machines, no longer expensive curiosities, but genuine alternatives to desktop computers, portable computing, powerful enough to run the same software, thin and light enough to carry batteries that lasted hours, and wireless networking, first through cellular modems, then through Wi-Fi, meant that computing could happen anywhere, in coffee shops, in airports, in homes without network cables snaking through walls. The 2000s brought computing into daily life in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Social networking sites emerged. Friendster, MySpace, then Facebook, creating persistent online identities, networks of connections, streams of updates from friends and acquaintances. Computing became social, personal, integrated with human relationships and communication patterns. Search engines became portals to all human knowledge. Google's PageRank algorithm, launched in 1998, revolutionized how information was found, ranking pages by relevance and authority, making the web navigable later. Wikipedia, launched in 2001, demonstrated that collective knowledge creation could work, that thousands of volunteers could build an encyclopedia larger and more current than any printed reference, constantly updated, covering obscure topics alongside mainstream ones. Mobile phones, which had been simple communication devices, began incorporating computing power. Early smartphones like the BlackBerry focused on email, giving business users access to their messages anywhere, but the iPhone, released in 2007, reimagined what a mobile computer could be: a touchscreen interface, apps that could do almost anything: music, maps, games, photography, web browsing, all in a device that fit in a pocket. And the Android operating system, released soon after, brought similar capabilities to phones from dozens of manufacturers. Suddenly, computing was always available, always connected. People carried more processing power in their pockets than had filled rooms in the 1960s, and they used it constantly, checking email, browsing social media, navigating, photographing, messaging. Computing had dissolved into the fabric of daily life, become invisible through its ubiquity. Cloud computing emerged as major companies built massive data centers, server farms with thousands of machines, offering computing power and storage as a service. You didn't need to own a powerful computer anymore, could do intensive processing on remote servers, store files in the cloud, access them from any device. Computing became distributed, decentralized. Your phone, your laptop, your tablet, all windows into the same services, the same data, synchronized automatically. And through all these decades, from the enormous room-filling machines of the 1940s to the smartphones of the 21st century, one thing remained constant: the fundamental architecture that von Neumann described: processor, memory, storage, input, output. The principles remained the same even as the implementation changed beyond recognition, from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits to microprocessors with billions of transistors, from mercury delay lines to magnetic cores to silicon chips storing gigabytes, from punched cards to magnetic tape to hard drives to solid-state storage. The underlying concepts persisted, evolved, but never completely disappeared. And now, as we sit here in the glow of screens, in a world where computing is everywhere, in our phones and watches, in our cars and homes, in the infrastructure that powers cities, in the satellites orbiting overhead, it's worth remembering that quiet progression, that accumulation of ideas and innovations, each generation building on what came before, solving new problems, opening new possibilities. The remarkable thing about this history, this long arc from mechanical calculators to quantum computers being developed today, is how much of it was driven by human needs that never changed. The need to count, to remember, to communicate, to solve problems that exceeded the capacity of individual minds. What changed was the medium, the speed, the scale, but the fundamental impulse remained constant. There's a certain poetry in how computing evolved, how each breakthrough made possible by the last. Transistors couldn't have been integrated into circuits without understanding gained from building vacuum tube computers. Microprocessors couldn't have been designed without the accumulated knowledge of how processors worked at larger scales. The internet couldn't have grown without personal computers to connect. And those personal computers needed decades of miniaturization before they could sit on desks instead of filling rooms. And through it all, through every generation of technology, there were people, individuals with names and lives and struggles, who saw possibilities that others missed, who persisted through failures and setbacks, who built on each other's work, sometimes with credit, sometimes without. The women who programmed ENIAC, whose contributions went unrecognized for decades. The engineers at small companies who competed with giants. The hobbyists who believed that computing should belong to everyone, not just corporations and governments. Consider the languages that emerged, each one a different philosophy about how humans and machines should communicate. Fortran saying that programmers should think mathematically. COBOL arguing for business-readable code. C prioritizing efficiency and direct hardware access. Later languages like Python emphasizing readability and ease of learning. Each language embedded assumptions about what mattered, what problems were worth solving, how programmers should think. And the arguments that raged, debates that seemed technical but reflected deeper values, open source versus proprietary software, whether code should be freely shared or carefully protected, whether computing power should be centralized in data centers or distributed to individual devices, whether privacy or convenience should take precedence when those values conflicted. These weren't just technical questions, they were philosophical ones, about ownership, about control, about what kind of world we wanted to build with these powerful tools. The speed of change itself became a defining characteristic. Moore's law, the observation that the number of transistors on a chip doubled roughly every 2 years, held true for decades, meant that computers became exponentially more powerful. That last year's breakthrough became this year's baseline, became next year's obsolescence. People who learned to program on one generation of machines found their knowledge outdated within years, had to continuously adapt, learn new languages, new paradigms, new ways of thinking about problems. And yet some things persisted. Some programs written in the 1960s still run today, maintaining critical infrastructure, banking systems, air traffic control, because the cost and risk of replacing them exceeds the benefit. So modern programmers sometimes find themselves working with COBOL, with systems designed before they were born, maintaining bridges between past and present, ensuring continuity even as everything else changes. The story of computing is also a story about abstraction, about creating layers that hide complexity. Early programmers worked with machine code, ones and zeros, then came assembly language, symbolic names for operations, then high-level languages, then frameworks and libraries, each layer making it easier to build more complex things, allowing programmers to think at higher levels, to compose solutions from pre-built components, standing on ever taller towers of accumulated code. But abstraction has costs. Fewer people understand the lower levels, how data actually moves through circuits, how operating systems manage resources, how networks route packets. We build on foundations we don't fully understand, trust that the layers below us work correctly, and mostly they do. But when something breaks at a deep level, when a security flaw is discovered in fundamental protocols, when hardware behaves unexpectedly, the specialists who understand those depths become invaluable, keepers of knowledge that seems almost arcane. There's something dreamlike about the pace of transformation. Someone born when ENIAC was being built in the mid-1940s has lived through the entire computer age, from room-sized calculators to artificial intelligence, from punch cards to voice interfaces, from computers as rare institutional resources to computers as ubiquitous personal devices. The world they were born into and the world they inhabit now are almost unrecognizable to each other, and all of this change, this revolution, happened within a single human lifetime, and the changes continue, accelerating, if anything. Quantum computers beginning to demonstrate capabilities that classical computers struggle with. Artificial intelligence systems learning to perform tasks that seemed uniquely human, generate text, create images, drive cars, diagnose diseases. The boundaries of what machines can do keep expanding, pushing into territories we once thought belonged exclusively to human intelligence. But perhaps the most profound change is how computing has become invisible, woven so thoroughly into daily life that we barely notice it. The phone in your pocket contains millions of times more processing power than the computers that guided Apollo to the moon, and you use it to check messages, to share photos, to navigate, to listen to music. Computing has become infrastructure, like electricity or running water, something we depend on without thinking about, until it stops working. The story circles back to those early dreams of mechanical calculation, to Babbage imagining engines of brass and iron, to Turing conceiving of universal machines, to the programmers setting switches on ENIAC. They were all reaching toward something, a vision of machines that could extend human capability, that could remember perfectly, calculate tirelessly, process information at scales beyond human capacity, and we've achieved that vision, exceeded it, built systems more complex and capable than those pioneers could have imagined. And yet, the fundamental questions remain: what should we do with this power? How do we ensure that computing serves human flourishing? How do we preserve privacy and autonomy in a world of constant connection? How do we prevent the tools we've built from amplifying our worst impulses along with our best? These aren't technical questions, they're human ones, and they require the same careful thought, the same patient problem solving, the same willingness to learn from mistakes that built the technology in the first place. Tonight, in this quiet moment, with the story told, we can appreciate the long journey, the countless innovations, the accumulated wisdom that brought us from mechanical gears to quantum bits, from rooms full of vacuum tubes to chips smaller than fingernails, from calculations that took days to computations that happen in nanoseconds. It's a story of human ingenuity, of collaboration across generations, of dreams made real through patient effort. And the story isn't finished, will never be finished, because each solution creates new problems. Each capability enables new questions. Each generation builds on what came before and reaches toward what comes next. The computers of tomorrow will seem as magical to us as today's smartphones would seem to those ENIAC programmers. And yet they'll be built on the same foundations, the same principles, the same human desire to understand, to calculate, to remember, to connect. So we let the story settle like dust after a long journey. And in the settling, we can see the path we've traveled, the distance we've come, the ingenuity and persistence required at every step, from the first mechanical calculators to the quantum computers being developed in laboratories today. It's all one continuous thread, one unfolding story, one long conversation between human minds and the machines they've built to extend their reach. The lights in the server rooms keep blinking. The electrons keep flowing through circuits. The data keeps moving through networks. And somewhere, someone is writing code, solving a problem, building something new, continuing the work, adding their contribution to this endless unfolding, this quiet revolution that began with gears and now encompasses the world. And in that ongoing work, in that patient building, there's something almost meditative, something that connects us to all those who came before, who sat at their desks and drawing boards, who soldered circuits and debugged code, who imagined possibilities and worked to make them real. The story continues, will always continue, as long as there are problems to solve, questions to answer, dreams to pursue, through circuits and silicon, through light and electricity, through the endless patient work of making machines think. The hum of the computers fades, becomes background, becomes silence, and in that silence the story rests, complete for now, but never truly finished, waiting for the next chapter, the next innovation, the next dreamer who will push the boundaries a little further, and the work goes on quietly, persistently, one calculation at a time. There is a kind of quiet that exists only in the presence of collected things, a stillness that settles over rooms where objects rest behind glass, where voices soften instinctively, and footsteps echo with a particular reverence that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I find myself thinking about these spaces tonight, these sanctuaries of memory and artifact, these buildings that stand in cities and towns across the world, holding within them the fragments of what humanity has made and lost and remembered and wondered about. Museums. The word itself feels weighty, substantial, like something you might hold in your palm and turn over slowly, examining its surfaces, its textures, the way light catches along its edges. Tonight, I want to walk through the story of these places to trace the long and winding path that led from ancient collections hidden in temple storerooms to the grand marble halls we know today, from private cabinets of curiosity to institutions dedicated to preserving everything from painted canvases to preserved butterflies, from fragments of pottery to the very bones of the earth itself. The air in a museum has a particular quality, doesn't it? A coolness, a measured humidity, the faint scent of old wood and stone, sometimes a trace of conservation chemicals, the nearly imperceptible hum of climate control systems working to keep everything at precisely the right temperature, the right moisture content, protecting what has been gathered. I imagine walking through empty galleries in the hours before dawn, when the guards make their rounds and the building breathes in the darkness, when artifacts sit in their cases with no eyes upon them, waiting, patient, as they have waited for decades, sometimes centuries. These spaces hold such strange contradictions. They are at once monuments to the past and thoroughly modern institutions. They are free and yet carefully controlled, open to all and yet governed by unspoken rules of behavior. They promise to show us the world and yet can only ever offer us the smallest fraction of what exists. The history of museums is not a simple story, not a straight line from then to now, but rather a tapestry woven from many threads, from the hoarding impulses of ancient rulers who filled storerooms with tribute and treasure, from the scholarly passions of Renaissance collectors who arranged shells and minerals in wooden cabinets, from the imperial ambitions of nations that sent ships to distant shores and brought back what they found there, from the democratic ideals of revolutionaries who believed that what had belonged to kings should belong to everyone. Tonight, as I trace this history, I want to move slowly, to linger over details, to imagine the textures and atmospheres of these collected spaces as they evolved across the centuries. I want to think about the first person who looked at an object, a painted vase, a carved stone, a pressed flower, and decided it should be kept, should be preserved, should be arranged alongside other objects for contemplation and study. I want to consider the impulse behind collection itself, the human desire to gather, to organize, to make sense of the world by assembling pieces of it in one place, to create order from chaos, to build little universes behind locked doors. And I want to follow this impulse forward through time, watching as it transformed, as private became public, as hoarding became scholarship, as wonder cabinets became institutions, as the very idea of what a museum could be and should be shifted and evolved. The museums we visit today, with their admission desks and gift shops, their audio guides and educational programs, their conservation laboratories and digital archives, these are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. And yet, they are also thoroughly modern creations, shaped by contemporary values, contemporary technologies, contemporary debates about access and representation, and whose stories get told. So let us begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can reach, in the ancient world, where the roots of museum culture first took hold in soil we can still examine, still touch, still wonder about. The ancient Greeks had a word for it, mousion, a place sacred to the muses, those 9 divine sisters who governed the arts and sciences, who whispered inspiration to poets and philosophers, who presided over memory itself. In Alexandria, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, under the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, there stood a mousion that was unlike anything the world had seen before, not a temple exactly, though it served sacred purposes, not a library alone, though it contained more scrolls than could be counted, but rather a great institution dedicated to learning, to collection, to the preservation of knowledge. Imagine it, if you can, this sprawling complex of buildings near the royal palace, its lecture halls and dining rooms, its gardens planted with specimens gathered from across the known world, its astronomical instruments gleaming bronze in the Mediterranean sun, and everywhere, the collected things. Scholars walked these halls on royal stipends, freed from the need to earn their living, able to devote themselves entirely to study, to observation, to the careful documentation of everything they could examine, botanical samples pressed and labeled, anatomical specimens preserved in ways we can only guess at, minerals and gems arranged by color and weight, manuscripts copied and recopied to preserve their contents. This was collection as a form of power. The Ptolemies understood that to gather the knowledge of the world was to possess a kind of sovereignty that transcended mere military might. They sent agents to distant ports with instructions to copy any book that arrived on a ship, sometimes keeping the originals and returning the copies, building their collection through a combination of patronage and what we might today call systematic acquisition. But the mousion was not a public institution, not in any sense we would recognize. It served the scholars, the elite, the court. Its treasures were not displayed for the common people to wander past on a quiet afternoon. Its knowledge was guarded, protected, accessible only to those deemed worthy of entry, and in time, as all things in time must, it faded, was damaged, was partially destroyed, until finally the great mousion of Alexandria existed only in historical records and in the imaginations of those who read about it and wondered. Yet the impulse it represented never disappeared. It simply transformed, migrated, found new expressions in new contexts. In ancient Rome, wealthy citizens built private collections that filled entire wings of their villas. Statues plundered from Greece lined the colonnades. Painted panels adorned the walls. Libraries held scrolls in Latin and Greek. Gardens displayed exotic plants brought from the far reaches of the empire. These were not museums in the modern sense. They were expressions of status, markers of cultural sophistication, demonstrations of wealth and taste. The collected objects existed primarily to glorify their owners, to impress visitors, to signal membership in an educated elite. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History Concels, described these collections with a mixture of admiration and criticism. He marveled at the rare specimens and artistic treasures, but also questioned the obsessive accumulation, the competitive hoarding that drove collectors to pay fortunes for a single statue or painting. And when Rome fell, when the empire fragmented and contracted, much of what had been collected was lost, melted down for the metal, burned for fuel, buried in rubble, scattered across a landscape that had forgotten how to maintain such elaborate structures of cultural preservation for centuries. Through what historians once called the Dark Ages, the primary preservers of collected knowledge were the monasteries, those isolated communities where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, where libraries grew slowly, one volume at a time, where certain precious objects, reliquaries, illuminated gospels, carved ivory panels were kept safe behind stone walls. These were not museums. They were treasuries, sacred repositories. The objects they contained were venerated. Their value was primarily spiritual rather than aesthetic or scholarly. A fragment of bone from a saint mattered not for its physical properties, but for its connection to the divine, its ability to work miracles, to draw pilgrims who would kneel before it in supplication. Yet even here, even in this religious context, the impulse to collect and preserve was being maintained, kept alive through centuries of upheaval and transformation, waiting for conditions that would allow it to flourish again in new forms. The turning came gradually, as most turnings do, in the city-states of Renaissance Italy, in the courts of ambitious princes, in the studios of artists who were also scholars, also scientists, also philosophers of a new kind. In Florence, in the 15th century, the Medici family began to assemble collections that went beyond mere displays of wealth. Cosimo de' Medici and later Lorenzo the Magnificent gathered not only paintings and sculptures, but also ancient manuscripts, coins and metals, carved gems, mathematical instruments, anatomical specimens, natural curiosities. Their collections served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the family's cultural leadership. They provided material for study and contemplation. They attracted scholars and artists to Florence, creating an intellectual environment that would help spark the broader cultural flowering we call the Renaissance. And crucially, these collections were sometimes accessible to scholars, to artists who wanted to study from classical models, to visitors deemed worthy of viewing such treasures. They existed in a space between private and public, between hoarded treasure and shared cultural resource. In the Medici gardens, young artists like Michelangelo studied ancient sculptures, learning anatomy from marble figures. Absorbing the principles of classical composition, the collection served as a kind of three-dimensional textbook, a teaching tool that existed in physical space rather than on a written page. Other Italian princes followed suit. In Mantua, in Ferrara, in Urbino, in Rome itself, collections grew and multiplied, each ruler trying to outdo the others, each collection reflecting the particular interests and obsessions of its patron. Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, created a studiolo, a small private study, where she surrounded herself with paintings, sculptures, musical instruments, books, ancient artifacts, cameos, and medals, creating an intimate space for contemplation and intellectual pursuit, a room that was both a collection and a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. But these were still fundamentally private spaces, controlled access, serving the needs and desires of individual collectors. The idea that such collections might belong to the public, might serve civic or educational purposes, that was still germinating, still forming in the minds of thinkers who were beginning to imagine different relationships between rulers and ruled, between knowledge and power. The 16th century brought a new phenomenon, the Wunderkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosities, a form of collection that spread across Europe like a particularly virulent idea, taking root wherever there were people with means and curiosity and space to house gathered things. These cabinets were entire rooms, sometimes entire buildings, filled with a bewildering array of objects, natural specimens and artistic creations, scientific instruments and religious relics, the exotic and the familiar arranged side by side according to principles that seem strange to modern eyes. A Wunderkammer might contain a narwhal tusk labeled as a unicorn horn, a coconut carved into an elaborate cup, coral branches and crystalline minerals, insects pinned in rows, coins from distant lands, an ostrich egg mounted in silver, anatomical models in wax, mechanical automata, paintings of landscapes real and imagined, all of it jumbled together in a profusion that overwhelmed the senses. These collections were not organized by the taxonomies we would recognize today, not separated into art and natural history, not arranged by chronology or geography. Instead, they followed a logic of wonder, of curiosity, of the desire to assemble a microcosm, a world in miniature, where everything connected to everything else in ways both obvious and obscure. Ole Worm, a Danish physician and collector, created a cabinet so famous that visitors traveled from across Europe to see it. His collection filled a large room from floor to ceiling, antlers and tusks mounted on the walls, birds and fish suspended from the ceiling, shelves packed with shells and minerals and preserved creatures, each object labeled and catalogued in his meticulous records. And here, in these cabinets, we can see the beginning of something recognizable, the impulse not just to collect, but to organize, to document, to create systems of knowledge based on physical evidence. These collectors were amateur scholars, proto-scientists, building their understanding of the world by gathering pieces of it and studying them closely. The cabinets served multiple functions. They impressed visitors with the owner's wealth and learning. They provided material for study and contemplation. They satisfied a deep human hunger to know, to understand, to make sense of a world that was revealing itself to be far larger and stranger than anyone had previously imagined. Ships were returning from voyages of exploration and conquest, bringing with them objects that European collectors had never imagined, feathered cloaks from the Americas, carved masks from Africa, porcelain from China, specimens of plants and animals that defied existing categories, that demanded new ways of thinking about the natural world and humanity's place within it. The cabinets of curiosity swelled with these imports, each new object raising questions, suggesting connections, challenging established understanding. A collector might spend hours examining a single shell, noting its spiral pattern, its weight and texture, comparing it to other shells in the collection, trying to understand the principles that governed its form. In the 17th century, the pace of collection accelerated, and with it came new ideas about how collections might be organized, what purposes they might serve, who might have access to them. The Ashmolean Museum opened in Oxford in 1683, not as a private cabinet, but as a public institution, the first of its kind. built to house the collection of Elias Ashmole, which itself incorporated the earlier collection of the gardener and naturalist John Tradescant and his son, also John Tradescant. The Tradescants had created what they called the Ark, a collection of rarities displayed in their London home. Visitors could pay a small fee to view stuffed birds and preserved fish, ethnographic objects from Virginia, a dodo's foot, Guy Fawkes's lantern, the hand of a mermaid, or so it was labeled, objects both genuine and fraudulent, wondrous and mundane, all mixed together in that characteristic 17th century profusion. When this collection moved to Oxford, when it was installed in a purpose-built building, when it was placed under the care of the university, something fundamental shifted. The objects were no longer primarily the possessions of an individual. They belonged to an institution. They existed for study, for the advancement of knowledge, for the education of scholars, and the edification of the curious public. The building itself was designed with this purpose in mind. The ground floor served as a chemistry laboratory. The upper floor housed the collections. Visitors climbed the stairs and entered rooms where specimens were arranged in cabinets, where they could examine objects firsthand, where the material evidence of the world's diversity was made available for contemplation. This was revolutionary, not in the sense of sudden upheaval, but in the quieter sense of fundamental reorientation. The idea that collected objects might serve public good might belong not to a prince or a private enthusiast, but to an institution dedicated to learning. This idea would take root and spread, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. In London, Hans Sloane was assembling a collection of staggering scope. As a physician and naturalist, he had traveled to Jamaica, had studied plants and animals, had gathered specimens, had corresponded with collectors and scholars across Europe. His collection eventually numbered more than 71,000 objects, dried plants, minerals, coins and medals, books and manuscripts, ethnographic artifacts, natural history specimens of every description. When Sloane died in 1753, he bequeathed his collection to the nation on the condition that Parliament pay his heirs £20,000, a fraction of its true value. Parliament agreed, purchased Sloane's collection along with several important libraries, and established the British Museum, which opened to the public in 1759. The British Museum represented a new model, a national institution founded by Act of Parliament, housed in a grand London mansion, Montague House, its collections available to all studious and curious persons, though in practice access was controlled. Visitors needed to apply in writing. Tours were conducted in small groups at appointed times. The museum served the public, but on its own carefully regulated terms. The collections were arranged in a manner that reflected both the cabinets of curiosity that preceded them and newer systematic approaches. Natural history specimens filled some rooms. Manuscripts and books occupied others. Ancient sculptures and artifacts were displayed in separate galleries. The sheer volume of material defied easy categorization, but the attempt to impose order, to create meaningful arrangements, this was central to the museum's mission. Elsewhere in Europe, royal collections were beginning their transformation into public institutions. The Louvre, which had served as a royal palace, began to open parts of its collection to the public even before the French Revolution. Artists could visit on certain days to study and copy masterworks. Scholars could request access to view specific objects. Then came 1789 and the Revolution, and suddenly the entire question of who owned cultural patrimony was violently reframed. The royal collections, the treasures of the church, the possessions of fleeing aristocrats. All of this became, in revolutionary ideology, the property of the nation, the heritage of the people. The Louvre was transformed into the Muséum Central des Arts, opening to the public in 1793. Imagine it, these galleries that had been the domain of kings, now walked by citizens who had never dreamed of entering such spaces, who stood before paintings and sculptures that had been hidden behind palace walls, who were told, "These belong to you now. These are yours to see, to study, to claim as part of your national inheritance." The ideals were lofty: universal access, education for all, the democratization of culture. The reality was more complicated. The museum quickly became a repository for art looted from conquered territories. As Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, they sent back paintings and sculptures, entire collections, cartloads of cultural treasures that were displayed in the Louvre as evidence of French supremacy, of the Republic's and later the Empire's civilizing mission. This pattern would repeat itself again and again. The museum as an instrument of nationalism, of empire, of cultural assertion, institutions that claimed to represent universal human heritage while simultaneously serving very particular political purposes, advancing specific national narratives, legitimizing conquest and appropriation. The 19th century saw museums multiply across Europe and North America. Each major city needed its museum, needed its temple of culture, its storehouse of knowledge. These buildings rose in classical style, the columns and pediments, marble and bronze, architectural forms that deliberately echoed Greek and Roman temples, that positioned the museum as a sacred space, a secular cathedral dedicated to art and learning. Inside these grand buildings, new approaches to collection and display were being developed. The old jumbled arrangements of the cabinets of curiosity gave way to systematic organization. Objects were grouped by type, by period, by geography. Natural history museums separated their specimens into taxonomic categories. Art museums arranged works by school and chronology. The goal was not wonder but understanding, not amazement but education. Curators emerged as a professional class, scholars who dedicated themselves to the study and care of collections, who developed expertise in specific areas, who published catalogs and research papers, who saw the museum as a research institution as much as a public attraction. Conservation became a science. People began to understand that objects deteriorated, that light and humidity and temperature and handling all caused damage, that preservation required active intervention, specialized knowledge, controlled environments. Museums built laboratories, hired chemists and restorers, developed techniques for stabilizing fragile materials, for halting or slowing the inevitable processes of decay. The great natural history museums of the 19th century were particularly ambitious in their scope. They aimed to collect and display the entire diversity of life on Earth, to create comprehensive taxonomic collections that would serve scientific research, to educate the public about the natural world through displays of mounted specimens, of skeletons, and taxidermied animals arranged in lifelike poses. The American Museum of Natural History in New York, the Natural History Museum in London, the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, These institutions sent expeditions to every continent, collected millions of specimens, built vast research collections stored behind the scenes, accessible to scholars but never displayed to the public. The visible exhibitions were merely the surface. Beneath them lay storerooms that held the bulk of the holdings, drawers of insects, jars of preserved specimens, bones and skins and pressed plants, all carefully labeled and catalogued. Carl Akeley, the taxidermist and sculptor, pioneered a new approach to natural history display, creating habitat dioramas that showed animals in meticulously recreated natural environments. He traveled to Africa to study elephants and gorillas, took detailed measurements and photographs, collected plants and soil samples, then recreated entire scenes in museum halls, the animals mounted in lifelike poses, surrounded by painted backdrops and actual vegetation. The effect was to transport viewers into another world, to create windows onto distant ecosystems. These dioramas required enormous labor, teams of artists and technicians working for months or years on a single display. But they represented a philosophy, the idea that museums should not simply show isolated specimens, but should educate visitors about ecology, about the relationships between organisms and their environments, about the interconnectedness of natural systems. Art museums were developing their own philosophies of display. Debates raged about how paintings should be hung, whether by chronology or by school, whether walls should be crowded with works or each piece given space to breathe, whether the goal was comprehensive display or selective presentation of masterpieces. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought new technologies that transformed what museums could be. Electric lighting freed institutions from dependence on natural light, allowed evening hours, made possible the illumination of interior spaces that had been perpetually dim. Photography created new possibilities for documentation, for cataloging, for sharing images of collections with scholars who could not visit in person. Museums became sites of spectacle, of grand exhibitions that drew enormous crowds. The plaster cast galleries were particularly popular, where reproductions of classical sculptures and architectural elements allowed visitors to experience works they could never see in their original locations. A museum in Boston or Chicago could display casts of the Parthenon sculptures, could create a kind of virtual tour of European cultural monuments, bringing the world's heritage to those who could not afford to travel. But this was also the height of colonial acquisition, European powers ruling vast territories in Africa and Asia, sending anthropologists and archaeologists to excavate and collect, shipping cultural treasures back to metropolitan museums, often with little or no consultation with local populations, with minimal documentation of context or significance. The ethnographic museums filled with objects taken from colonized peoples, masks and sculptures, textiles and ceramics, tools and weapons, religious objects that had been removed from their sacred contexts, displayed behind glass for European audiences who viewed them through lenses of racial hierarchy and evolutionary theory. The museum served to reinforce colonial narratives, to position non-European cultures as primitive, as frozen in time, as subjects for Western study, rather than as dynamic societies with their own histories and values. The early 20th century also saw the rise of industrial magnates who became museum patrons on an unprecedented scale. Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Clay Frick, J.P. Morgan. These men accumulated vast fortunes and used portions of them to build or support museums, sometimes driven by genuine passion for art or science, sometimes by desire for social prestige, often by both. Their philanthropy shaped the museum landscape, created institutions that bore their names, that reflected their tastes and interests. The Museum of Modern Art in New York, founded in 1929, represented a new kind of institution dedicated not to the art of the past, but to contemporary creation, to living artists working in new styles and media. This required different curatorial approaches, different ways of thinking about what belonged in a museum. How to evaluate work that had not yet stood the test of time. How to balance aesthetic judgment with historical documentation. MoMA's founding director, Alfred H. Barr, Jr., developed an approach that treated modern art as a legitimate field of study, that sought to establish canonical narratives, that used the museum's authority to validate certain artistic movements while marginalizing others. The museum became not just a repository, but an active participant in shaping artistic discourse, in determining what counted as important, as worthy of preservation and display. The Second World War brought new challenges and transformations. Museums across Europe evacuated their collections, packed masterpieces into crates, sent them to country estates, to salt mines, to any place that might protect them from bombing. The Louvre dispersed its holdings across France. The British Museum moved objects out of London. In Germany, museum directors made anguished decisions about what to save, what to leave behind. When the war ended, questions of ownership and restitution became urgent. Artworks looted by the Nazis, cultural objects displaced by the chaos of war. Who owned what? Who had the right to reclaim pieces of cultural heritage? These questions would persist for decades, remain unresolved even now, as museums grapple with the provenance of their collections, with the ethics of possession. The post-war period also brought democratizing impulses, a belief that museums should be truly accessible, not just legally open, but actively welcoming to all segments of society. This meant rethinking everything from admission fees to exhibition design, from the language used in labels to the representation of different cultures and perspectives. New types of museums emerged, science centers with hands-on exhibits, children's museums designed specifically for young visitors, living history museums where interpreters in period dress recreated past lifeways, eco-museums that treated entire landscapes as collections, that worked with local communities to preserve and interpret regional heritage. The Pompidou Center in Paris, opening in 1977, challenged conventional museum architecture with its inside-out design, its exposed structural elements, its escalators climbing the exterior in transparent tubes. This was a museum that announced itself as contemporary, as experimental, as fundamentally different from the classical temples that had dominated museum design for 2 centuries. Technology continued to reshape museum practice. Climate control systems became more sophisticated, allowing precise regulation of temperature and humidity. Conservation techniques advanced, enabling the preservation of increasingly fragile materials. Computer databases transformed collection management, making it possible to track and access information about millions of objects. But the late 20th century also brought crisis and critique. indigenous peoples and descendant communities began demanding the return of cultural objects and human remains, questioning the right of museums to hold materials taken without consent, sacred objects displayed as ethnographic specimens, ancestors' bones studied as archaeological data. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, required U.S. museums to inventory their collections of human remains and sacred objects, to consult with tribes, to repatriate materials when claims were made. This represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamics that had governed museum collecting, an acknowledgement that museums did not have absolute rights over everything in their possession. Similar movements arose around the world, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, in Africa. Communities demanded not just the return of objects, but also participation in decisions about what was collected, how it was displayed, what stories were told. Museums began, slowly, reluctantly at first, to share authority, to collaborate with source communities, to recognize multiple perspectives and competing narratives. The question of colonial acquisition became impossible to ignore. The Benin bronzes in European museums, the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum, the bust of Nefertiti in Berlin, countless other objects whose presence in Western institutions was predicated on conquest, on unequal power relations, on a belief that European museums were the proper guardians of world heritage. These objects became flashpoints for debates about restitution, about cultural ownership, about the post-colonial responsibilities of institutions built on colonial foundations. Museums responded in various ways. Some resisted calls for repatriation, citing legal ownership, concern for conservation, belief in universal museums as repositories for all humanity. Others began programs of return, of collaboration, of shared stewardship that allowed objects to circulate between institutions, to be cared for jointly by museums and communities of origin. The digital age brought new possibilities and new challenges. Museums began digitizing their collections, creating online databases that made holdings accessible to anyone with internet access. Virtual tours allowed people to explore galleries from anywhere in the world. Three-dimensional scans could capture objects in detail that exceeded what was visible to the naked eye. But digitization also raised questions. Who owned these digital assets? Who controlled access? How did virtual experience relate to physical encounter? Could seeing a high-resolution image of a painting ever substitute for standing before the actual work, feeling its scale, seeing the texture of brush strokes, experiencing it in the specific context of a gallery space? The 21st Century Museum is a complex institution, simultaneously guardian of the past and agent of contemporary relevance, educational resource and tourist destination, research center and community hub, keeper of collections and facilitator of experiences. These multiple roles create tensions, competing demands, ongoing negotiations about purpose and priority. The blockbuster exhibition became a staple of museum programming, major shows of popular artists or themes, designed to draw large crowds, to generate revenue, to raise the museum's profile. These exhibitions required years of planning, complex negotiations for loans, extensive marketing campaigns. They could introduce new audiences to museums, but they also risked turning institutions into entertainment venues, prioritizing spectacle over scholarship, crowds over contemplation. At the same time, many museums were working to become more responsive to their local communities, developing programs for underserved populations, creating exhibitions that addressed contemporary social issues, hiring more diverse staff, examining their own histories and practices with critical eyes, asking difficult questions about whose voices had been centered, whose stories had been ignored or marginalized. The museum as a neutral space, a temple of timeless values. This idea was being challenged, replaced by recognition that museums are always political, always shaped by the contexts in which they operate, always making choices about what to collect, what to display, how to interpret, what narratives to privilege. These choices have consequences. They shape how visitors understand the world, how they see themselves and others, how they imagine past, present, and future. And now, as we move deeper into this century, as museums continue to evolve, as they grapple with questions of access and equity, of repatriation and representation, of sustainability and relevance, we find ourselves at a moment of both continuity and transformation. These institutions still perform many of the same functions they have for centuries. They collect, preserve, study, display, but the frameworks within which they operate are shifting. The assumptions that once seemed solid are being questioned. The future of museums is being actively imagined and debated and created. Perhaps the most profound thing about museums, the thing that makes them both strange and necessary, is that they exist in a kind of temporal suspension, objects removed from the flow of ordinary time, held in a state of preservation that resists decay, resists change, resists the natural processes that would otherwise return them to dust. A painting created 400 years ago hangs on a gallery wall, its colors still vivid, protected from light and moisture, monitored and conserved. It exists now in a way it never existed for its original viewers, who saw it in natural light, in a domestic setting, who watched it darken and crack over years of exposure. The museum version is both more and less than the original, more perfectly preserved, less embedded in lived experience. This suspension creates a particular relationship with the past. Museums offer us encounter with things that have survived, that have been chosen for survival. But this choosing is never neutral, never complete. For every object preserved, countless others have been lost, forgotten, deemed unworthy of the effort required to maintain them through time. The museum collection is always a fragment, a tiny selection from the infinite array of things that humans have made and used. It represents not the past itself, but rather our present-day ideas about what matters in the past, what deserves to be remembered, what stories we want to tell about where we came from and how we got to here. And these ideas change, shift with each generation. Objects once considered important fall out of favor. Things once ignored are rediscovered, revalued, brought out of storage and placed on display. The museum is a living thing in this sense, constantly rearranging itself, reconsidering its holdings, responding to new scholarship, new social movements, new ways of understanding the world. Consider the shift in how ethnographic collections are viewed. Objects once displayed as curiosities, as evidence of primitive cultures, are now understood as sophisticated artistic and technological achievements, as expressions of complex cosmologies and social systems. The objects themselves have not changed, but our capacity to see them, to understand them, to respect them has evolved, or begun to evolve, the work is ongoing, incomplete. The museum also creates a particular kind of looking, a mode of attention that is both focused and abstracted. We stand before objects removed from their original context, from their functional purposes, from the hands that made and used them. We look at them aesthetically, analytically. We read labels that provide information, interpretation, context that the objects themselves cannot convey. This can be deeply illuminating. It can also be distorting. A mask created for sacred ceremony becomes an art object, appreciated for its formal qualities, its craftsmanship, but divorced from the spiritual power it once held, the religious functions it performed. The museum transforms it, even as it preserves it, changes its meaning, even as it maintains its physical form. Some theorists argue that this transformation is inevitable, that once an object enters a museum, it becomes something different, a museum object, subject to new regimes of value, new systems of meaning. Others insist that objects retain their original significance, that museums have a responsibility to honor and maintain these connections, to work with communities to ensure that sacred or culturally significant items are treated appropriately, not merely preserved but respected. These tensions are productive. They generate conversations, spark reforms, push museums to reconsider their practices, but they are also uncomfortable. They reveal the extent to which museums are implicated in histories of colonialism, of appropriation, of unequal power relations. Facing these histories honestly requires courage, requires a willingness to change, to relinquish control, to share authority in ways that fundamentally alter how institutions operate. And yet, despite all these complications, despite the valid critiques and necessary reforms, there remains something powerful about the museum experience, something that draws millions of people through their doors each year, that creates moments of wonder, of connection, of recognition. To stand in a gallery surrounded by paintings from another century, to see how artists wrestled with light and color, how they tried to capture fleeting moments, to express inner visions, this offers a kind of communion across time, a reminder that humans have always been driven to create, to make meaning through material form, to examine a fossil millions of years old, to contemplate the vast stretches of geological time, the processes of evolution and extinction that have shaped life on Earth. This can induce a kind of productive vertigo, a recognition of our own smallness, our brief tenure on this planet, and simultaneously our connection to everything that came before, to see objects from distant cultures, to learn about different ways of organizing society, different belief systems and value structures, different solutions to universal human challenges. This can expand our sense of possibility, challenge our assumptions about what is natural or inevitable, remind us that the world we inhabit is just one of many possible worlds. Museums at their best create spaces for this kind of encounter, for slowing down, for looking closely, for thinking deeply, in a world that increasingly demands constant distraction, perpetual connectivity, rapid consumption of images and information. The museum offers something different, permission to linger, to contemplate, to let mind and eye wander. The future of museums remains uncertain, as it always has been. Institutions that have survived for centuries have done so by adapting, by finding new relevance for each generation, by balancing preservation with innovation, tradition with transformation. Some museums will fail this test, will become mausoleums rather than living institutions, will retreat into irrelevance. Others will find new ways to serve their communities, new partnerships and collaborations, new technologies and methodologies. They will continue to evolve, to surprise, to challenge our expectations of what a museum can be. And through all these changes, the fundamental act of preservation continues. In climate-controlled storage rooms, in conservation laboratories, in digital archives, museum workers labor to protect the material evidence of human and natural history, to maintain these collections for future generations, whose interests and questions we cannot predict, whose needs we cannot anticipate. This is an act of faith, a belief that these objects will matter, that future people will want to encounter them, to study them, to draw meaning from them. It is also an acknowledgement of responsibility, a recognition that we are merely temporary stewards, caretakers of materials that belong, in some sense, to everyone and no one, to the past and the future simultaneously. Tonight, as I think about museums in the quiet hours, I imagine all those objects resting in darkness, behind locked doors, waiting for morning when visitors will return, when gallery lights will illuminate them once more. They wait patiently, these fragments of the past, these carefully preserved remnants. They have already waited so long, through centuries and millennia, through periods of neglect and periods of intense attention. They can wait a little longer. And I think about the people who will walk through those galleries tomorrow, who will pause before a particular painting or specimen, who will feel something stir in them, curiosity or recognition or wonder, who will carry that feeling out into the world, changed in some small way by the encounter, reminded of something they had forgotten, introduced to something they never knew existed. The museum persists, adapts, transforms, but at its heart remains this simple thing, this gathering of objects, this attempt to hold fragments of the world in one place, to create meaning through collection and arrangement, to preserve what would otherwise be lost, to remember, to study, to share. The lights dim in the empty galleries. The last footsteps fade away. The building settles into its nighttime rhythms. The gentle hum of ventilation systems, the occasional creak of old wood, the presence of all those collected things, silent, patient, enduring. Outside, the city continues its restless motion, but here, in this purposeful stillness, time moves differently, measured not in hours, but in centuries, in the slow accumulation of knowledge, the gradual transformation of understanding, the patient work of preservation that connects past to present to future, and somewhere in a storage room accessible only to staff, or a conservation laboratory where specialists work with microscopes and delicate tools, or a curator's office where research continues into the night. The work goes on, cataloging and documenting, analyzing and interpreting, caring for collections, adding slowly to the sum of human knowledge. The museum sleeps but does not rest. It waits, it preserves, it holds within itself the multiplicity of stories, the diversity of human experience and natural phenomena, the complexity of history that can never be fully captured, never completely understood, but must nevertheless be gathered, protected, studied, shared. In the morning, doors will open once more, visitors will enter, and the cycle will continue, has continued for centuries, will continue for centuries more. If we choose to maintain these institutions, if we commit the resources and care required, if we believe that preservation matters, that encounter with the past and with the diversity of the world enriches the present. The last thought fades like a voice trailing off into distance. The museum remains solid and present, a repository of memory, a space of possibility, a bridge across time, gathering the world's fragments, holding them gently, offering them to whoever comes seeking, whatever they hope to find.